This podcast is a project of the Climate Designers Network.
Hey, this is Eric. Welcome to a very special deep dive edition of Climify. Back a few years ago, somewhere between seasons 1 and seasons 2, we had a small mini-series called Deep Dive with two of our listeners, Rachel and Grace. And we're trying it again today, but this time with our producer, Cam Berkins, as she talks with Dr. Melinda Adams again, but this time goes deeper into her work. But before we get to that, I'm happy to announce that we have a new fiscal sponsor. So I need to read this quick statement. This podcast was supported in part by grant funding from the U.S. Department of Education's Title IX grant program through the University of Illinois Center for Global Studies. The content of this program does not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Education, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal government. So my first takeaway, Cam, is that you did a great job on the interview.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's really great to be here, and I had so much fun interviewing Melinda. She really is a fantastic scholar. So
You did a good job.
for the opportunity. Thank you.
Was
Thank
that
you.
your
I mean,
first
Melinda,
big interview?
It was. But Melinda made it very easy. It was more of a discussion. It was more of a conversation, for
Yeah,
sure.
it was very, I would say, smooth. It seemed kind of effortless. You both connected right through, I think, your similar work that you're doing. So I think that helped.
Definitely. And on the subject of that work, I'm really excited that we're adding this new segment to Climify, where we take key lessons from the episode, things that we think you guys should listen for while you're going along with the podcast, and that we think are particularly important for our listeners to pull or pay attention to. And then after the interview ends, we're going to be sharing some calls to action, so some ways that you individually can tangibly make a difference. And those will also be informed by the guests that we interview that episode. So very excited to be trying some new stuff out and that y'all be on the journey as we do so.
Yeah, this is definitely going to be a journey today, but I also think will help us as we integrate these into the next season 4. And it looks like, just as an update for everyone, I got all of our guests and some ones that I didn't think we could get. I didn't think we could get some of these guests. And so that's pretty exciting.
I agree. I think y'all are going to be very surprised by some of the people on,
I hope
on
so.
this season.
Surprised, informed, entertained. That's going to be inspired in a couple months. Sometime in June, we'll be launching that season 4. So yeah, the key takeaways. I listened to your interview with Melinda and I was taking a lot of notes. First of all, there was a lot there. And first of all, to me, was the concepts of Solastalgia and Soliphilia, because I had never heard those terms before. And I would just want to add too, like, in every answer that she gave to your question, it could have been a whole other episode with every one of those answers. So she's just such a deep guest.
I agree. And she brings a wealth of knowledge, right? She definitely allows her lived experience, her individuality of having gone to a tribal college and being of two different tribes, because in indigeneity, you sort of actually take on the name and I won't say heritage, because obviously she embodies aspects of both of her tribal identities, but it's a matrilineal culture. And I think that also really came through in her interview.
Yeah, I would agree that is something that I took away from it, was her intertribal worldview coming from two different tribes. And when she was discussing that, I was really moved by her description of how she was connecting with other Native peoples and they're collected. But also I was felt joyful really in her response to that and how she's overcoming that, which could be Soliphilia, right? And how they're making their way back to their cultures that were taken away from them.
Definitely. And on the subject of involving real scholars in this work and people who are experiencing the effects of climate disaster or communities, indigenous communities in particular, that have already survived a sort of post apocalyptic scenario. Melinda has worked very closely with the leaders of tribes. So Dr. Erica Ton and the Honorable Chairman Ron Good of the North Boko Mono tribe. And she was very clear that a lot of her research would not have happened if not for the experiences and the wealth of knowledge, the wisdom that she received from these people. So definitely want to make sure that we shout out the elders and also scholars who are informing our current work.
Yeah, I agree. That was something else that hit me while I was listening to her. And you mentioned post apocalyptic, and I had heard that before, really, that indigenous peoples are post apocalyptic. And she spoke about that a lot. So that's something to listen to in her conversation with you. And toward the end of one of her answers about that, she was talking about the hurt and the trauma and the healing that she and other Native peoples are going through. She called it post apocalyptic stress syndrome, which I had never heard before, too. And I could hear the hurt in her voice when she was talking, especially at that part. And I really was feeling those same emotions with her. And I was listening later on and we'll talk about this at the end of the episode about what to do with those feelings of hurt and trauma, where you can take those into action. But she was just a very moving guest.
Totally agree. We talk about climate change and climate disaster as if it's this existential threat, and it definitely is. But there are some communities that have already survived
Mm.
an existential threat, right? And there are communities that are going to be affected by climate disaster more acutely and more quickly than others. And I think it's really
Yeah.
important that in our podcast, we are attentive to the fact that we will not all experience climate disaster
Right.
in the same ways. So
Right. Right. For sure.
very, very excited.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should just get to it and let everyone listen to Dr. Melinda Adams.
Hi, Dr. Adams. Thank you so much for joining us for this special after the interview Climify segment. So, as we've discussed, this is something new that we're trying to add a little bit more exposition to the episodes that you did with Eric in the past. Just add a new layer that explores more of your work that we didn't get to discuss last time, but also gives listeners an kind of behind the scenes look into who you are and the kind of work that you do.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Kim, for the invitation. And yeah, I'm excited to peel back a little bit more of the layers. So, Sean, yeah, I appreciate being here.
Absolutely. Okay, I guess we'll just dive right in. So, in your work, you discuss two terms that I'd never heard before called solastalgia and soliphilia. And so, solastalgia, I understand to be this grief, this like existential anguish that's brought on by climate disaster, whereas soliphilia is the mitigation methods and the things that we can do to mitigate that anxiety. And I feel like this grief is something that many people feel, maybe is felt more by certain communities than others. And so I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more about the places and spaces where you've encountered solastalgia.
No, I appreciate that and having literature to kind of talk about the environmental grief that, in my understanding, underrepresented communities are experiencing the most. So having something that points to it has been helpful for visualizing the experience that I offer as a professor, as an instructor, and having students learn on the land. So I think I said in the last episode, like learning on the land is how I feel like students are connected the most to climate issues, to learning indigenous knowledges and traditional ecological knowledges and practices. So it's been rich for me to have something to point to as a scholar. So I want to start with the paper, giving full credit to both of my co-authors. So the ideas of soliphilia and solastalgia were reintroduced to us by Dr. Erica Tom, who's a wonderful scholar at Santa Rosa Junior College in California, and her personal experience with having to evacuate wildfire, like having her community burn down and having that firsthand experience. So she's really credited to Dr. Tom in helping us conceptualize what it is that we're feeling, what it is that we're experiencing. So first and foremost, Dr. Tom inviting me into this conversation and similar work that we do. And then, of course, one of my mentors and dear friends, he should be a doctor, but the Honorable Chairman Ron Good of the North Fork Mono Tribe, my other co-author, who in his own way has experienced the grief that people carry of being disconnected to lands and seeing those lands experience some of the effects of climate change in the Yosemite area of California. So both credit to them just bringing together these ideas of what climate grief is, but also that individual climate hope that we have by working on the land together, by stewarding good fire, something that was taken away from Indigenous peoples when the state quote, was becoming a state. So credit to them and just my experiences working with younger people, college-age people who, one, didn't even in California, there weren't many that I interacted with that got the experience to work on the land or familiarize themselves with the ecosystems that is one of the most biodiversity rich places in the world. So giving them an experience or being with them an experience where they're learning on these lands together, coupled with learning about Indigenous peoples, both the climate solutions that we have, like homegrown within our communities, but also the colonization of our peoples, the heavy history that we have of erasure and displacement, lifeways being severed. So it's a powerful experience that I use fire, that all three of us, Dr. Tom, the Honorable Chairman Ron Good, and myself, use fire as a lens to teach about. So these two ideas, they came about by Dr. Tom. And to your focus on solastalgia, right? That grief. And I also want to add these were students along with myself. I spent about 5 years in California. And during that time, I experienced not directly, but I was there when the Car Fire happened, Paradise Fire, the Dixie Fire. And for me, like literally having to leave where I was, the August Complex Fire. So those are those infamous photos of the San Francisco skyline and the orange hazy skies. Yeah, so like literally seeing what felt like an apocalyptic situation. That's kind of the definition of soul nostalgia, right? That grief or that fear. I'll just give credit to them and also my personal experience and what inspired like the writing of okay, climate grief, but what's individual climate action, right? This care that you have for a place, wanting to know about these homelands and Indigenous people's presence in them. I think it's like a coupled approach, emphasis on like the Indigenous perspective of soliphilia, the hope and the action, individual action. So as a critical scholar, I wanted to introduce you to Lawrence Gross. So they're another Anishinaabe person. Anishinaabes come hard, like in scholarship. Anishinabes are very present in scholarship. And so they conceptualized PASS, he calls it PASS. And story tells us that Indigenous peoples are post-apocalyptic peoples. So that's what he refers to as post-apocalyptic stress syndrome, that we all experience that environmental loss, the cultural loss that we've experienced through different iterations of colonization. So I turn to that a lot as post-apocalyptic. That's solastalgia defined as well. So returning to the land stewardship practices that our peoples held since time immemorial, fire being one of them, but also our relationality with, I think, Eric really likes this term, more than human relatives. And it's that respect that you have for those plant and animal beings that teach us And that's not like a soft science approach. It's like actual science that science is just now catching up to. Like, oh, if we're going to survive the effects of climate change, we need to pay attention to our living surroundings and the ecosystems that take care of us. So, long answer, that's kind of where the idea of these two terms came together in this paper that we co-wrote using fire as a lens to kind of unpack a lot of these things, but then very much informed by scholars like Lawrence Gross that focus on indigenous peoples being post-apocalyptic. But I also want to add, like we're also very futuristic. Like we also keep in mind the health and well-being and futurity of the next generation. So yes, survived apocalypses, but also always envisioning our future and carrying it forward.
Wow. Thank you so, so much. I mean, just all the context, and I'm definitely going to research post apocalyptic stress syndrome and Lawrence Gross.
Yeah, and I would say, I mean, he writes as an indigenous scholar, but certainly other cultures from around the world that have been touched by colonization, not touched. Let's be real here. That our cultural lifeways have been severed from threads of colonization and ongoing colonization. You know, we're all post in that way. We're post apocalyptic, but we're hopeful, right? We hang on to the hope and futurity for our next generation.
Totally, totally. And this is amazing. You're so great at the interview process because you always just naturally lead into the next question that I wanted to ask, which is this idea of soliphilia, right? So you talk about reframing solastalgia with the lens of fire, which is so interesting because fire is, I mean, as you were talking about, really thought of as destructive and scary. So to think of it as something that can actually bring about rebirth, I know that sounds hand wavy, but can give people hope. I'm wondering if there are other examples that you've seen in your work of ways for individuals to combat solastalgia and to connect to the hard science of the world, recognizing that we're part of the world and have some responsibility to it. If that makes sense.
Right. No, it totally does. I appreciate that. And I'm recalling some of the conversation with Eric that after listening, I was like, oh, I wish I could have added. But I joke about it in my classes. I teach about Indigenous people's science, like this, the weaving together, but more so centering Indigenous knowledges and how Western sciences is calling on Indigenous knowledges to be integrated into more land management plans and climate action plans. So I have a laugh with my students that when I give them these readings, they're like, I needed a dictionary or I needed a glossary of sorts to kind of get through some of the readings. And they're so nuanced by Indigenous scholars that are talking about different realms of environmental science, ecology, fire ecology. And at first I was like, oh man, I don't want to overburden them with work because they're already attentive scholars and have a lot going on. But at the same time, I rejoice in kind of this way of approaching Indigenous knowledges and sciences and that they are nuanced, they are sophisticated. You do need some time to sit with the articles and understand what it is that the author's trying to say. So on the one hand, I'm like, oh, I want people to learn, but at the same time, it's nuancing a lot of the information or maybe the incomplete pieces that people have of Indigenous peoples. So I'm torn in that. But back to your question, I think about soliphilia in the article. We certainly talk about cultural fire, right? Indigenous led, prescribed fire that's led with traditional ecological knowledges as a way to invoke soliphilia, that connection that you have to a place. And in a separate but related article that I've written for the Native Plant Society, I talk about this conceptualization that was brought forth with Indigenous fire practitioners that I work with in the Sacramento Delta region, and they're Indigenous women reclaiming the inherent right to practice cultural fire, to regenerate, or like terms you used earlier, revivify or reclaim native plant species. So they've worked with me on these terms, and they conceptualized it as indigenous homeland histories and indigenous homeland ecologies. And that does a couple of things. It adds an indigenous lens to otherwise ecological restoration practices or otherwise conservation practices, which are embedded in our worldviews as indigenous peoples. So it brings indigenous voice to that. And it also talks about like the connectedness to land and the action behind it. So going back to what I said earlier, like I've taken ecology, environmental science classes, and there wasn't a readily opportunity as much to be on the land learning these things, and then let alone having indigenous knowledges being incorporated or led as part of the lessons. So my personal idea with this soliphilia approach was learning about those homeland histories, indigenous homeland histories and indigenous homeland ecologies. So you're learning about restoration practices that are rooted in indigenous knowledges, whether they be ancestrally, what indigenous peoples participated in land care and tending, or they're modern or contemporary practices that indigenous peoples have adapted due to the changes in climate, due to the changes in their environment. So for me, that was written after the Solastalgia Soliphilia article, but certainly there was context in the original article with Chairman Ron Good and Dr. Erica Tom. And then for me, like as an indigenous person that works in this space of ecology, environmental science, physical geography, we don't get to the solutions or the restoration practices without first learning about those indigenous homeland histories and indigenous homeland ecologies. So I hope that's helpful. And my hope is that that's integrated more into some of the fieldwork classes that are offered at institutions, like kind of coupled with TEK or traditional ecological knowledges. And for me, traditional ecological practices.
Totally. I mean, so actionable. We're back to actionable because I feel like it adds a layer to I'm going to go on a hike, like I'm going to learn the homeland history of the place that I'm going to. I'm going to center indigenous knowledge. I'm going to be intentional about being on the land, not just, I don't know, do it as just like a fun exercise, which is just thinking a little bit more critically about the lands that we're on and our relationship to them. So that's really insightful. Thank you so much. And so I think that again leads into our next question very beautifully. You talk about how sophisticated and nuanced Indigenous history and knowledge systems are. And I think for those who are outside of the community or outside of understanding of indigeneity, it can be very easy to flatten the nuance. And so I'm wondering, I guess it's a two-part question. If you can explain this idea of something I think you've called intertribal connectedness. So, how indigenous knowledge systems are distinct but also unified. There's a through line that I think is true and comes through. But then also you spoke about your students joking about needing a dictionary to understand the reading and this burden of education, which you are an educator, you're a professor. So I get that. In that sense, it might not be burdensome, but you work with government agencies, you talk about ongoing colonization, and in your conversation with Eric, you do talk about just how recognition really influences the prospects for certain indigenous tribes and communities. And so I am wondering about this intertribal connectedness, but then also how that is rectified with having to work with government agencies that you have to teach about something that they have stolen from you.
I appreciate that, especially picking up on some of the thoughts that I share and the scholarship that I try to write, to do those things, to nuance and to add context. So to talk about like the intertribal connectedness that I think naturally just write about it, I frame things and then I also add, well, yes, this is a common goal amongst a lot of the tribes that I currently work with, and a lot of historically the connectedness that we had and we still share. So I, of course, you know this, but for listeners, just when we work with indigenous peoples, indigenous tribes, it's important to remember that the solutions that are proposed or the land stewardship that you read about, it's very place based and it's very tribal specific. So I think in the conversation with Eric, we talk about veering away from learning something, assuming the role of an expert, and then taking those lessons to somewhere else that they don't belong to and assuming that they're going to work or assuming that they're going to be fruitful. That's kind of another form of erasure when you do that, like not remembering that there are indigenous peoples and underrepresented groups specific to a place that have these long term connections with the places that they live, the environments that encompass them, the waters that they're nearby and take care of. So, just first and foremost, when I talk about intertribalness, it's not to say that this is all encompassing for all tribes or this fire stewardship that we do here. It's plentiful and rewarding in other places that we go. So that nuance again, it comes into the conversation because oftentimes TEK is situated amongst or the connection to it is almost that all tribes think this way or all tribes operate this way. So we want to avoid doing that, which is why I'm adding the place based and tribal specific specificity to what it is that I offer and write about. Having said that, that's intertribal lens and intertribal worldview that I talk about and write about. That's my experience as a scholar that's navigated these different life experiences that have all been tribally rich. So I am fortunate to not just learn about my tribe and our ways and in our culture, but also being in a space that allowed for me to learn about lots of different tribes and lots of different cultures and then finding the connectedness in that, maybe not so much in techniques specifically or language, for example, but that we all experienced some of the same trauma. We all experienced some of the same like erasure, but we also find joy in a lot of similar ways through humor, through finding our way back to our cultures that were taken away from us. So recognizing those things build upon like what I conceive as an intertribal worldview. And the two things that stood out to me with how we come together or what we see eye to eye on is this visibility. Like we're all wanting more visibility in the work that we do. And that could look a lot of different ways, like in pop culture or in history or in environmental movements. When you see Indigenous peoples in the news and it talks about our stories in a way that's responsible, that's building visibility for the work that we're all individually doing. None the other way. If it's not well represented or not well written, that's a pain that's felt through a lot of our communities too. So that stands out to me, just the visibility of like an intertribal connectedness. And then we talked about earlier, like adding details or pushing back against the overgeneralized, oversimplified narrative that's been written for us by scientists, historians, even in the now. So adding nuance and adding details to that, I feel as though we have a shared worldview on those types of things. And so to wrap up here, why I use intertribalness, one is because I'm a couple of different tribes and like matrilineally through matriarchy, I belong to my mother's tribe. So that's the tribe that I'm enrolled in, but my dad's also native too from a different tribe. So I have this like duality of worldview, which is really neat and really rich because I think about things in a lot of different ways, but then add on, I got my education very young from a lot of different Native people and sharing histories and culture and ways of being. We call it ways of knowing and being, like as a term in scholarship, because that encompasses many different things, not just specific like ways of learning, but that's our way of saying all ways of learning. So knowing and being. I've even heard of doing, like I was taught by a indigenous. She talked about gendered lenses and knowing, being, and doing the way we do things. So I thought that was pretty clever. hard for me to drop in my writings, but knowing, being, and doing is kind of how she presented it to us. But nonetheless, so intertribal worldview, it's a pushback against in scholarship what has been written. So if you see a lot of historical writings, anthropological writings that talk about connectedness of tribes, it's usually pan-Indianism is the term that folks have used. But I've learned that that's a harmful term, or could be a harmful term, because it misrepresents or overgeneralizes our individual distinction, like our individual tribal groups and our cultural ways of being. So pan-Indianism, I'd learned a long time ago, it's not what our communities want to use. So because of that, my pushback against that is using intertribal, like that distinction between each of our tribes and cultures. I hope that's helpful. I know these are like such like kind of nitpicky things, but my job in doing this, and the peoples that I represent, this is how a lot of us maybe agree on a narrative being written. We'd rather gravitate towards these things that give more of a details or more of an intellect behind who it is, what we do, and why we do it.
It makes perfect sense, everything you just said. And I really appreciate you clarifying what the community would like to be called, or the language that you use, because to what you were saying about having your history written for you being a form of erasure, I do appreciate you for educating us. I know we had this whole thing about like, oh, education, and is that a burden? But I do appreciate you being visible and letting us see you. So thank you. Of course. Which brings me to my final question. So you talk about Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and centering this knowledge in the work that you do and the way that you study, and having it just inform your worldview. You don't go out of your way to be who you are, basically. And it sounds as if you spoke about this a little bit in your last interview with Eric, but really had to sort of learn to incorporate that in your work and to realize the fact that who you are is the basis of your scholarship as well. And so I guess my question is, how do you maintain that confidence, maintain that power, strength in the face of these systems that are historically oppressive, but like you said, colonization is continuing in the present day. It's not just this like historical relic. Um, and I think politicized and minoritized peoples feel this very acutely, going back to solastalgia and how that's something that certain communities feel more strongly than others. I think this erasure is something that many people from erased backgrounds can understand. So, how do you grow and maintain your sense of identity in the face of all these systems? And what advice might you have for other scholars, but also just other people who are out here trying to ma- maintain their truth in the face of adversity?
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of combine some thoughts that I had. I think you mentioned like working with agency, which I do a lot of in land management, fire stewardship work, and kind of how I approach that. So just me wanting to focus on futurity. I just wanted to share with listeners that I dream of a world where I won't need to work with agency as much, because our worldviews and our life ways and our stewardship practices are respected, and we're given the space and access to land to be able to invoke those, like actualize those. So I envision a world where autonomy is respected and sovereignty is expressed. But until we get there, that's why I do the work that I do and hold those conversations and educate and re-educate people about not just the past, but the future works that the people that I work with are doing, and that I myself try to make space for to try to do. So I dream about this world, but like grandmothers and advocates before me, I don't do this work so that I reap the benefits myself or my generation. I go into the work knowing that I might never see the fruits of our labor, the people that I work with, our labor. And that's kind of been our mode and modality as Indigenous peoples on the front line. And grassroots advocates that have pushed so hard for change that now we're seeing a little bit of that change. For example, like fire stewardship honored as cultural burners and practitioners, equating that to the status of a state certified burn boss. Like that for me is a future I didn't quite envision when I first got into this work. So yeah, understanding that mode and modality, dreaming of a future where we don't need to steward, co-manage anything. Like we're fully autonomous in our stewardship and our quote unquote management. So yeah, I do this work to one day make that pathway a little bit smoother for those that are coming up before me, but also teaching about the tools to younger natives. I get to teach young native scientists now that want to do policy work, that want to do quote land management, or how we say it, land stewardship work. So having that lens that brings that to them, also being a native woman in a very male dominated fire space, I think it adds a unique lens, one that will be empowering to them once they navigate that world. So, and then to kind of round out what you asked before, just how do we do this work, which is kind of my favorite answer to listen to when others are asked. I'm like, oh, how do I do this? But as the person on the other side, like, how do you do this work? I would definitely say that it's hard, heavy work. And the way that I've shared before is doing this work for 6 years, a very minimal timeline, but a really long time when you're younger with fire specifically, but all it encompasses like a severance of our life ways, removal of our peoples, not being credited with land techniques that if we were able to exercise them, wildfire would look quite different, in all honesty. And ecosystems would thrive, quite honestly. So being in that space and learning firsthand from elders, I articulated this in a separate interview, but like going through the hurt, going through a lot of the recognizing trauma when you didn't know you would be recognizing trauma going into this work, being with them as I recognized it, as we slowly try to regain knowledge of our cultural ways. So being told no when we were fully ready to go and had already made plans and already invited community onto the land to learn with us, cultural burning, being told no by other apparatuses outside of our community. It's a lot of hurt. It's living day colonialism. But then the heal, being on the land and seeing younger people just wanting to learn from elders and wanting to learn from practitioners in spaces where they otherwise wouldn't be able to have access to or learn directly from traditional ecological knowledge and practices holders, that joy and that look of hope. I shared earlier, I have to believe in the hope to do this work and to get through the hurt, to get to the heal. That's kind of where I'm at with that. So my advice is to take up space, be so sure of yourself and what you have to offer the world, but also surround yourself with the people who, one, are going to check you. That's another part of the humble fire that we didn't get into, knowing that you're representing a people. That's a huge burden. And sometimes I don't always get it right. So being surrounded by people that are open and willing to ground you and to help shape your perspective so that it represents as best as it can a voice that otherwise isn't able to be heard as much or seen as, or a person that's not able, a people that isn't able to be seen as much. So surround yourself with people that are going to ground you, that are going to push you to be the best that you could be in your scholarship, in what you have, your craft, in what you have to offer the world. You want somebody that's going to push you. What is it, the quote that if you're like around people that just say yes, or you're around people that just believe in your ideas, if you're in a room of people like that, you're in the wrong room. So having that ability to people to better you in the best possible way that's true to who you are and a scholar or person that you want to be, invite that into the room as well. But then also make space for the hurt, make space for the pain that you'll feel, the pushback that you'll get, the misrepresentation that oftentimes with underrepresented communities we experience. Take the time to, and people tell me that all the time, and here I am trying to make time and space to do that. But really be intentional about setting that time and space aside for yourself And for me, like the way to heal that and the way to do what it is that I'm doing, which is doing the scholarship, it took me coming home. It took me being surrounded by my culture, like truly being surrounded by my culture to find those threads of strength and to make space for those times of hurt. So all of that. If someone could do that's what I can offer. And that's for a person that's been doing these things for a while and has taken me a little bit of time to learn these lessons that the grandmothers and the cultural practitioners, the language learners, the storytellers, they've been so generous to share with me. I owe them that, right? To learn these lessons and to be vocal about how I've learned them. They're not conventional. They may not be for everybody. These are for our communities. And as allies, giving us the space to learn that or to understand without questioning, I think would be most helpful in these journeys that our scholars are embarking on. So, yeah. Cam, I hope that's helpful.
So helpful. It's so helpful. I'm over here just jotting down all the notes for the show notes later. No, thank you. Thank you so much. It's very striking to hear you reference the past and the future in the same breath, right? We have to learn from our elders, from the people who have already paved the way, who have already navigated the world that we're living in, especially when you think about a post-apocalyptic context, right? Like people have survived this and thusly have knowledge to impart about how they did so. But then looking to this futurity and the selflessness I think it takes to know that what you're doing might not be experienced by you, but to do that work anyway. And so I really just appreciate your humility, your hopefulness, because I do think that that is easy to lose. But just reiterating that it's necessary, I feel is going to be really helpful for the people who have the privilege of listening to you. So thank you. Thank you so, so much. Well, that wraps up all the questions that I have. Is there anything else that you'd like to impart? Any more knowledge before we head out of here?
It may not be knowledge, but always gratitude. So I really appreciate you, Cam. I appreciate Eric, but just learning the intro segment from the actual episode, you put in a lot of work and you read my scholarship. Like I'm so honored, and I just am so appreciative that you took so much time to learn about some of the things that I have to say from the community members that I learn and try to do my best for. So just Climify, this is one of my favorite casts and opportunities to take advantage of. So as last episode, we say Ashant, we say all good things. So thank you so much, Cam, and thank you, Climify.
Thank you, Melinda.
Wow. Cam, great job. Great job with that interview.
Thank you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. This is a new segment that we're doing at the end of every one of our episodes, wrapping it up, unpacking it. It's our calls to action based on what we've heard our guests talk about. So this is a very practical part. So, Cam, what was one of your first calls to action that you took away from Melinda's interview?
Well, we are a design podcast at our core, right? So I think one of the main takeaways is that we have to decolonize design and decolonize design education. We really need to
Right.
rethink, reframe, redesign the ways that we approach instruction, the ways that we approach action. I know that this is the call to action segment, and that's really it. We need to
Yeah.
think differently about the way we approach these problems because clearly what we've always done is not working and is actively harmful to the communities that are going to be experiencing these tragedies and this trauma the most.
Yeah.
So,
Agreed. And I don't think I know how to decolonize design. I I agree that that's a big call to action. I know there's a really great newish book out there by Dory Tunstall called Decolonizing Design. So that would be a good first step as a call to action to check out that book from the library, right? Where you work, Cam, or course, support the author and buy it. I own the book and I have not read it yet, but I do think that that would be a great first step, first reading to start that process. I would also say, as a call to action connected to that, is that we need to give Indigenous peoples more credit. And as she talked about, more visibility. We need to give them more visibility in the world. They're here. They have some great experience living here on this planet, and we should respect that more. I was really moved by her conversation about the ways of knowing, being, and doing. And since we are a design podcast, it reminded me of Herbert Simon's definition of the designerly way of knowing, where we learn from others and our own lived experiences what things work and what don't through doing. And so I think as designers, we can really pick up on some of what Indigenous peoples can teach us in our own work.
Definitely. And building on this idea too that Indigenous people are not, like indigeneity isn't
Mm.
some sort of bygone concept of the past. We're not learning from an extinct people. We're learning from a people that are thriving, that have a lot to teach us. And I think to your earlier point and to Melinda's point about visibility, there's some great media out in the world right now. So Killing of the Flower Moon is a new
Mhm.
one that
Have you
follows.
watched it yet?
I haven't, no,
Read the
not
book.
yet.
I've read the
Haven't.
book.
Probably it is very popular at my library right now.
Is it?
Everyone is
Okay.
interested. Yeah.
I bet. Yeah. I mean, it was a great book.
But also Reservation Dogs. Have you heard of this one?
Yes. Yeah. It's on
Yeah.
a queue on, I think, Hulu. It's one that my friend and his wife have told me, I think, a dozen times now to watch. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe that's a call to action too. Check out Reservation Dogs. This is not
Yeah.
an endorsement or a promotion, but to the point of acknowledging Indigenous people as existing and living in the here and now and having so much to teach us, but also just living their lives. I think it's
Yeah.
important to acknowledge that.
Yeah. With Killers of the Flower Moon as an example of call to action for giving Indigenous people more visibility and credit, I listened to an interview on a podcast with an elder from the Osage community, which is the native peoples in the film and the book. And they were talking about how Martin Scorsese really kept his word and worked with them throughout the film to make it more authentic and also give credit where credit's due and have them be a co-designer in the creation of that film. And they really appreciated that. So that was good to hear. That makes me feel a lot better about that particular book that became a film.
Yeah. So definitely, engage with Indigenous work, scholars, art, visibility and credit is really important. Melinda also talked about this idea of homeland history and
Hmm.
homeland ecology. And in the context of Soliphilia, right, taking the time to actually understand the land you live on rather than trying to apply one size fits all remedies.
Yeah.
Every place is different. Every place has a history and a methodology that's going to be most effective in caring for that place. And I remember she said something about thinking about that just in your daily life, right? So you don't have to be working the land. You don't have to be a fire practitioner
Right. Yeah.
to think about the land that you live on and show consideration for more than human
More than
relatives.
human.
And
She said,
yeah,
Eric likes that term, and it's true. I do
yeah.
like that term.
So,
More than human design. I think that's a call to action right there.
ooh,
Yeah.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah. Well, along those same lines, my last call to action had to do with what you just mentioned, where the indigenous homeland histories and ecologies. And I am truly interested in how Native peoples think about the future, or Native futurism, right? And as designers, we're creating things for the now, but also will impact the future. So I'm very interested in a call to action for designers to better explore that idea of what Native peoples want and need in the future, and how we can be collaborators in that to improve all of our lives. And I think that's something that we can do a lot better at, not just as designers, but as human beings living in this world. I think we can be a lot more respectful to one another. And I think that is, gosh, I sound so cliche, but that's definitely that was definitely a call to action for me, was to learn more about that, and how can that be more integrated in what I do as a designer and as a human.
Definitely. And as a human, empathy, you know?
I want to be more than human. I want to be more, I think we all should be more than human.
There it is. Final call to action, you'll be more than human.
Be more than human. That's our call to action for you. Well, thank you everyone for listening. And remember, if you have any calls to action, thoughts, or ideas about what you just heard, feel free to comment on our Instagram posts, send us a message. We'd be happy to include you on upcoming programs. Well, Cam, all good things. Ashon.
Ashon.
Climify is produced by Cam Birkins. Editing help by me. Designed by Ellen Keith Shaw and Christine Pilot. And a big thanks to Mark O'Brien and Natalie Walsh at the Climate Designers, who always support our efforts. If you want to hear more Indigenous voices from the Climify catalog, you can check out 2 of our older episodes. Katie Kamehameha from Season 3, Episode 13, and Sadie Redwing from Season 2, Episode 4. You can find design prompts and more information on all our guests this season at climatedesigners.org/edu/Climify, and on Instagram and LinkedIn at Climify Podcast. If you enjoy the work we all do here and you have a spare minute or two, we would truly appreciate it if you left a rating and review over at Apple Podcasts. The more folks that review our program, the higher the algorithm pushes up us in the search results. And in turn, the more likely we all can learn how to become climate designers. Hey, before you go, one last thing. In the spirit of bringing things back, one of the fun aspects of Season 1 was promoting musicians who were also designers. A singer-songwriter I loved from Season 1 was Octavio Romano. I reached out to her recently to include a song on this episode, and she recommended The Dance. It's from her 2019 album, Operta, for Open. Operta is Octavia's first solo EP, where she hopes the songs expose the beautiful, the ugly, the raw emotions and honest thoughts. It's an open door to a new, unexplored creative path and artistic identity. You can download this album and others by Octavio Romano at octaviaromano.bandcamp.com. Please enjoy The Dance.
Came and go, I love you for. You are already gone. Cup of coffee and the clock was on the wall. I loved you, but I had to go. You keep popping into my mind, doing the dance, and I can't kick you out. I just can't. You all run into your desks, but I ain't. I'm gonna fill my cup and go to bed. Such a pity it was we met and became one. Such a pity you had to leave behind, leave behind. Now I have to forget. Let me do that. All my trials seem like little spots blowing in the dust, blowing in the dust. Sometimes I wish I become you. That way I forget about me and you, me thinking about you. Such a pity it was we met, but I had to leave you behind. I'm going back, red sun, you whisper, I'm going back. Such a pity it was we met, but I had to leave you behind. Came and go, I loved you for. You are already gone. Came and go, I loved you for. You are already gone.